Let's get started. So, hi everyone. My name is Jasmine Banks and my pronouns are she, her. I'm the executive director of UnKoch, my campus, and I am thrilled to accept the invitation from the Jedi Working Group and extend my labor to discuss a tiny bit about white supremacy culture and how it impacts our dynamics within organizing. Next slide. Oh no, are you still sharing your screen? Oh, good. So today it's helpful for me as a person who's non-neurotypical to have a little bit of a roadmap. I want just to share with you what you can expect from this presentation, and that's what's happening right now, number one. Next, we'll have requests and agreements that I'm offering, and we'll hope that you can make commitments in the chat. Then I'll be offering some context and assumptions. The next thing I'll do is review white supremacy culture, although we won't have time to deep dive into it, but just have a high level overview for the point of time. And then we'll have an invitation to engage in a thought experiment that I hope everyone will put on their courage and vulnerability and give it their all. And then next we'll have an invitation to commit to anti-racist next steps. So the first thing I have is an agreement that, there you go, Tempest, thank you. Hold on, I need to put the presenter screen as my view because I keep not being able to see where you're at. There we go. So the agreement is the objective during the time is to engage in a conversation and collective curiosity in order to begin to process of addressing white supremacy culture and how it shows up in Stop the Money pipeline in our organizing. The assumption here is that you think that whether intended or not, when we all come together and create systems or have relationships with one another, that the social implications of living in neoliberal society means that white supremacy culture is going to show up. This is the assumption here is not that anyone is going to be accused of being a white supremacist. We're going to be inviting one another to be critical about the ways in which we've internalized habits of white supremacy and how they might manifest in larger interpersonal systems. I also have a request for you that you understand that we'll not cover every cultural manifestation of white supremacy in our limited time together. There are also some inherent features within our coalition which may never be addressed as a product of larger structures we can't change at this moment in time. For example, despite my ability to be a very organized Virgo, tomorrow I will not completely crush capitalism. But by participating in this space, you are a commitment to the continued practice of anti-racism. So if everyone will take a moment in the chat and put your first name and last name and indicate if you agree to the commitment that this is the beginning of the conversation and you will continue to explore work around anti-racism individually and in your spaces. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Oh, this agreement. I'm going to give you a verbal agreement so I don't have to change screens. Next slide, please. So again, I've got more context and assumptions. Today, we're going to discuss and evaluate white supremacy as it emerges inside a neoliberal context. And I'm not going to dive into the economics or political theory of capitalism, but for here, neoliberal context means the free market enterprise, rugged individualism, and our current economic iteration that pairs free market capitalism with liberal ideology. So within that context, white supremacy classically has been the beliefs and ideas purporting that natural superiority of lighter skinned or quote unquote white human races over other racial groups. A really important distinction here is this is not a conversation of ethnicity. You can ethnically be a person of color while racially being white, which if it sounds confusing, that's by design because race is a social construct designed to keep power in play. In contemporary usage, the term white supremacist has always been used to describe some groups espousing ultra-nationalist, racist, or even fascist doctrines. But within neoliberal society, we have to evaluate how doctrines shape institutions and structures that demand transformation in order for us to achieve justice and restoration with one another. Next slide. when I do these presentations as sort of like a 101 or 102 level, I always hear folks say, wait, but I'm white, I don't have a culture, or I'm European descendant, so that's my culture, while fully being immersed in white supremacy culture. I'm here today to tell you that capitalism, which is inherently racialized within a neoliberal society, and patriarchy combine forces with white supremacy to create an actual white identity. Brilliant scholar Barner Hess, who has recently been targeted by white supremacists for his incredible research and work, developed 8 distinct identities which embody whiteness. Now, again, I want to say that even people of color and Black folks can internalize white identity. Let's take a look at a few. There's the white supremacist that clearly marks white society, that preserves and names and values white superiority. Again, I'm assuming that none of you here are number one, the white supremacist. You think that whiteness and the culture of whiteness and white supremacy is violence. Next is the white voyeurist. White voyeurism won't challenge a white supremacist. They desire non-whiteness because it's interesting, pleasurable, seeks to control the consumption and appropriation of non-whiteness. This voyeur is fascinated with culture. For example, consuming Black culture without the burden of Blackness. This would be the person in your community. Maybe you've said it yourself, like, I follow all Black podcasts and I follow all Black Instagram accounts, or I have only Black friends. That would be a form of white voyeurism. Next is white privilege. This has been mainstreamed in a way within liberal society that critiques supremacy, but still has a deep investment in questions of fairness, equality under the normalization of whiteness and white rule. The sworn goal of white privilege identity is to increase diversity, and most recently, equity inclusion are the buzzwords. The fourth white identity is white benefit. The white benefit identity is sympathetic to a set of issues, but only privately, won't speak or act in solidarity publicly because benefiting through whiteness is a public good. Some POC are in this category as well, meaning that it benefits people like me who are light-skinned Black folks to enjoy colorism, which is a form of white benefit. Next, we have the white confessional, and anyone who's done racial justice organizing or even had these conversations as a person of color might have had an experience with a white confessional identity. This means they have some exposure of whiteness, and that takes place over the lifespan of the person's identity, but as a way of being accountable only to the person of color after the person of color has validated them, i.e. given them their ally cookies and said that they're a good white person. The next is white critical. This is an introduction into actually agitating against the culture of white supremacy. The white critical identity takes on broad critiques of whiteness and invests in exposing and marking the white regime, refuses to be complicit with the regime. Whiteness speaks back to whiteness. This is the kind of identity you see folks who are in their critical consciousness and are calling out other white folks' behavior and inviting everyone to do better. The second to last identity is the white traitor, who actively refuses to be complicit, names what is going on, and the intention of the white traitor identity is to subvert white authority or white power and tell the truth at whatever cost. That means that they are ready to dismantle institutions. The last, and according to Hess, the most desirable, is the white abolitionist, someone who's changing institutions, dismantling whiteness, and not allowing whiteness to reassert itself. Next slide. And I'm going to drop in the chat a link so that you can support Barner, who is going through it right now. Literal #1 white identity, white supremacists have been targeting him. And he deserves all of the support for his brilliant, brilliant work. Next, whiteness, in order to reproduce the myth of supremacy that creates the culture and identity itself, This culture does shift slightly depending on context and can be impacted by normative demands of patriarchy and capitalisms, but generally white supremacy culture falls within these norms. These norms engage a myriad of tactics to remain uninterrupted. And then we'll also drop the habits of white supremacy culture in the link for you to view, because we are assuming that you're coming to this space already having a little bit of a foundation into the conversation. And so we want to dive into some solutions and exploration. All right, next slide. Fantastic. So Malkia Devich-Cyril, former director of Center for Media Justice, co-founder of Media Action Grassroots Network, teaches us that conditions that are taking the lives of Black and Latinx communities with heart-shattering speed cannot be solved with economic solutions alone. A progressive movement that isn't organizing to dismantle structural racism isn't a progressive movement. It's a movement of white middle-class self-interest, where white people on both sides of the aisle are fighting to retain white privileges in different ways. Now, Mac's statement was specific about economic justice, of course, but it does invite us, it brings us into focus about what we must acknowledge if we seek to meet the conditions, not only to define ourselves as progressive organizers, but oriented toward justice. Our internal thoughts and beliefs about ourselves and others shape our interpersonal beliefs. These are our habits and our behaviors. These dynamics in turn inform our creation and or participation in institutions and systems that make up structures. White supremacy within an organizing context, then, is the material outcome of the failure of all of us to adopt anti-racist internal personal thoughts that lead to our beliefs, that inform our behavior, which inform our acceptance or rejection of institutional and structural norms. Next, and Amy, if you want to get folks in breakout rooms, now is the time, please. So let's take a look at one of my own personal habits that I've internalized from white supremacy culture. I am not only a Virgo, but a perfectionist, which I guess those astrological habits kind of go hand in hand. From a very young age, I struggled with wanting to always do the right thing, be right, never bad, never make a mistake. It's not an accident that I found myself drawn to higher education, to continued learning, to teaching, because I always wanted to be the one with the right answer in the room. So growing up, despite being Black and Native, I internalized habits of white supremacy. So perfectionism tells us that, that whiteness is perfect. So in this instance, I internalized the belief that I hold myself to standards of perfection. And when I make a mistake, I feel shame, and I believe that internalized narrative that I am a mistake. This translates into how I interact with others. Since whiteness mythologizes its perfection, the other who does not affirm ideal habits of whiteness is deemed pathological. So suddenly Jasmine becomes mistrusting, embarrassed of others' mistakes that they make. And then I move into this space in my brain where I believe that the mistakes of others are actual purposeful flaws and inherently wrong. I don't accept, learning styles that are different or deemed bad by the global ideas of white supremacy. Next, my interpersonal dynamics lead me into an institutional layer and dynamic. So then the standard by which we inform success or failure becomes rigid. It must be perfect. Therefore, we create policy, practice, and dynamics which reject the conditions which might produce error and are more likely to reinforce collectively held beliefs. So in my personal organizing, one way that my internalized white supremacy of perfectionism that again is reinforced in larger structures has showed up is judging folks who make mistakes on their resume or grammar and syntax, or folks that don't learn and report things the way I do. In fact, as I've unpacked my own bias and my own internalized white supremacy, I realized that I was regularly surrounding myself with people that I only thought were expert based on white-led institutes giving them accolades. And so I've had to, in order to not only decolonize myself, but to address my own internalized whiteness, I've had to create practices and create processes that subvert this natural behavior that I internalized. Let's go back to the other slide. And I want to offer folks in the chat, can you think of some ways that the myth of perfectionism within white supremacy culture show up in the institutional and structural level in your own life that you've witnessed? The breakouts can be about 10 minutes. Thank you. Everyone's shy, that's okay. So when we follow the logic of my interpersonal, oh, it's coming through, awesome. Going to grad school, law school was not an option. Working over capacity to try and achieve. I'm a community college teacher and often see teachers hold students to rigid deadlines. Yes, yes, those are all real examples. So if we follow my own path of personal development from internal to interpersonal to institutional, what we want to do is we're trying to create this process of how we evaluate ourselves within our organizing constructs is look at the history of structural white supremacy that we're upholding through these beliefs. So one thing that is an example of a structural or institutional level that kind of creates a feedback loop of my own ideas of internalized perfectionism is the historical denial of people with disabilities in leadership. That's structural, right? We can look to structures that across our movement, across coalitions, often folks with visible or marked intellectual disabilities, for example, also are often not put in leadership positions because of the structural dynamics. And then those ideas of internalized perfectionism sort of retool or recirculate those dynamics. Oh, not an option, you were forced to go. Maria said, rewarding, prioritizing product over process. Yes, that's exactly correct. Another person said, struggling when beginning to work with people who learn in different ways. Yes, yeah, that's real. This is for folks who are non-native English speakers, for sure. B said, worrying about if what I'm saying is doing perfect justice to the topic rather than speaking authentically from the heart. Correct. Yeah. It's also worth noting that white supremacy culture, going back to the outline of white supremacy culture and the antidotes, they often work in concert with one another, right? Perfectionism needs either or thinking in order to be successful. It's also worth noting that capitalism has a lot, and patriarchy have a lot of dynamics that also overlap, that sort of converge to make us, to engage us in a sort of behavioral norm that is not about choice or consent, but rather fulfilling social obligations that ultimately keep us so entrenched in harming one another and ourselves that we never truly question power structures that all of us have the power and the resources to transform. All right, let's move to the next one, Tempest. So in your breakout rooms, I'm going to ask you to consider a thought experiment. The thought experiment is a coalition in the enviro sector has good intentions and seeks to actively include Black, Indigenous, and people of color organizers addressing the coalition's campaign priorities. The coalition regularly features Native folks who are enrolled or adjacent to tribal communities. When funders and movement partners seek to interact and support the coalition leadership always mentions the BIPOC frontline organizers. Over the years, however, many BIPOC frontline groups have engaged, shared their ideas, and then suddenly shuttered their project, burned out, or stopped engaging. So as you're assigned to your breakout groups, I'm wanting to know what habits of white supremacy culture could be a factor in the high turnover rate and what unseen dynamics might be at play. So if we'll start the breakout groups and then we've got 10 minutes to discuss, and I'd like a representative to give ideas when we come back on what might be at play based on identity of whiteness and white supremacy culture. All right, we're coming back. Are folks still coming, or does it look like we just had a large drop off? Great. So if a representative from each of the breakout rooms will put themselves on stack and kind of report back the findings from the thought experiment. Starting with our group. Leah, do you mind?
Sure, yeah, we talked about various forms of white identity surfacing in the thought experiment. We talked about power hoarding, and we talked about professionalism, fear of open conflict. Those were kind of the main areas that we looked at in relation to this particular thought experiment, and had a really good conversation. Does anybody else want to add something?
Go for it, Ella.
Hi, y'all. And just to, yeah, I'm speaking for breakout room number 4.
Yeah.
And really happy to be connected with folks. My name is Elle, and I use she, her pronouns, just as a little intro. But we talked about a couple of different things. Primarily, or I thought one of the huge ones was the within the first into their campaign, as opposed to showing up for the existent one, for the work that has already been done. We mentioned kind of the sense of urgency and burnout and not building lasting relationships. We had a really good conversation about how class plays into all of this, and because money is power, and how folks need to be like showing up to these tables where there are movement partners and conversations about funding, and not just like used as kind of tokenization there. I'm trying to just peek back at my notes. And yes, I think that Sarah had some really lovely, like eloquent things to say about neurodiversity, and kind of, and I don't want to take all of the words. If I missed anything, or Sarah, you want to speak to that more, please jump in. But those are a couple of the things that we addressed. Oh, yeah, just I think that talking about neurodiversity in the course of the sense of urgency, in the and kind of recognizing, I'm really butchering your great job there, but as we are talking about like coalition partners, and recognizing the difference of everybody coming to the table there. But yeah.
Who was next on stack? Jump on in.
I think it's me. Yevgeny, I'm he, him pronouns. So we talked about a number of things about how basically, white supremacy suffuses all of the different institutions and all of the different pieces of the ecosystem, and it comes in everywhere. But one area that we focused in on was funders, and sort of this notion that, okay, one, these funders exist and have to be pleased, and they are largely white. And so, groups will just sort of contort themselves in different ways, and maybe, these BIPOC groups can't come in and push as radical of an agenda as they want because of the concern that the funder, and the other people in the coalition will also kind of like wall off because of the concern of like offending the funders or pushing back on the funders. And then we similarly talked about how there's this like sense of urgency issue where, we overpromise to the funders to get what we need, and then it all has to be turned in and turned really fast, which means, okay, well, if I, this is a place I sit on the STOMP policy team, so sometimes like I need a policy solution tomorrow, and that means I don't have time to go consult with all these different groups. But saying like, no, actually, you really do, because you're creating your own sense of urgency in many cases, or just sort of like trying to keep the funders happy instead of just saying, hey, look, no, we need another week. We need to consult with our group, with our full alliance coalition, and then we'll have a better product and one that's more inclusive.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always really struck by those of us in particular that are talking about fossil fuel finance and the impact of corporations on our environment and on our communities, how often we become a microcosm for the corporate control of our environment, but the funders become the corporations. And if we believe that we have the money to, or excuse me, the money, the power within our coalition, within our collective action to organize against, fossil fuel finance within money institutions, then we can organize our funders together. I'll share just sort of like a high level that what we're unpacking is very real. UnKoch, my campus, actually has a funder that funds the coalition pipeline, who are considering not funding us because they aren't very trustful of queer Black leadership. But here I am leading and teaching. And so it's an invitation about how we use our collective power as an ecosystem to really transform dynamics. Even if, again, we can't transform on a structural level, we can transform the institution of Stop the Money. And that will be our next thing, but let's get everyone else who is on stack. Who was next?
Sure, a report back from breakout number 7. We had a great conversation. I'm Ethan, he, him. We also talked about kind of pace and sense of urgency. And really, we were all just kind of acknowledging that though this is a thought experiment, it hits pretty close to home. And we've seen this play out many times. So it's good that we're really talking about it. Also talked about funding and funder demands, but also that just the access to resources in general. If everyone else at the table is paid staff and a frontline person is representing and doesn't have access to that kind of resources, that's a very real discrepancy that plays out just in the space. Also talked about the space itself and about how, even if there's a table set and there's there's all the right people, quote, at the table, how is that space run? How are the meetings run? How are decisions made? Is it truly collaborative, or does it feel more tokenized? And that also leads into kind of one of the last things was just talking about, is it truly relational, or is it more transactional? And what are frontline leaders getting out of it? If they're spending this time every week joining Zoom calls instead of being in and with community, are they really getting what they need out of it? Resources, support, to support the people that they're accountable to in the community. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it invites that broader conversation, as I said at the beginning of the call. Anti-Blackness or white supremacy culture and white identity really is really sophisticated about reproducing the other sorts of systems of oppression, which are capitalism and patriarchy, right? And within capitalism in particular, it's extractive, it's throwaway, it's consumeristic, it modifies people. So the white supremacy culture of tokenization is just creating a commodity out of our BIPOC organizers and saying, look what we have, okay, we don't need it anymore, toss it, right? And it really continues to stratify. In our group, we talked about how if you can locate anti-Black racism actively within a structure, an institution, or an interpersonal behavior, it's very, very likely that the other isms will follow. Who is next in the group? Ruth.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jasmine and Ethan. Ruth Breed, she, her, representing Group 6. That this is actually what I was going to touch on was tokenization. But I think other pieces here that to just continue what we've been kind of building together is around false urgency, and that these like campaign and funding deadlines are not real to somebody on the front lines who's like literally surviving their life.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge thing that comes up. And then in the tokenization where people are like featured publicly, but then internally, they have no decision-making power. They're not able to influence strategy, how money is allocated. So some of that is paternalism, like how decisions are made, who is in the decision-making team, body, how that plays out. And then what we were saying here too is that a lot of this, and then the piece around perfectionism and conflict avoidant. So people are bringing up things maybe challenging how money is allocated, or they look like they're the person that is the problem or causing the conflict, and then that becomes a struggle here internally as to what does like real equity look like. And so now, especially if they're a frontline person, they now have this struggle internally with how decision making works, and then also they're still fighting for their lives. So is it contributing to kind of a burnout cycle?
Yes, yes, yes. And one of the tactics of, neoliberalism in particular is to put Black and brown faces in white spaces and call it good. But introducing Black and brown folks into institutions or structures that are designed to crush them and marginalize them, create social violence, isn't justice. It's a performance of justice. All right, move to the next slide. So I've got 3 questions, and I will definitely be providing this, or Amy will be providing this to folks.
Oh, I'm sorry, group 3 didn't go.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you.
No problem. I didn't throw my name in the chat. I'm sorry. So I'm representing, I think it was group 3 or group 8. We couldn't figure it out, me and Taryn just now in chat. But in any case, it was really a fascinating discussion. And I think a lot of it's been touched on already in the groups that have come before. But, there was a sense that most likely there was some work undergoing some work that was already going on that the white funders came and sort of parachuted into, and perhaps started to do a command and control situation where they would put their vision of what was to be done onto the existing community. And there was ultimately a sense of disconnect and anger and frustration. And then on top of that, there was undoubtedly a lot of, we assume some burnout, because all of a sudden, you have this culture of urgency and perfectionism that was being overlaid on a system that was probably working pretty well as it was. But all of a sudden, their work was conditional on this funding. And so, like someone else said very eloquently, there's this attempt to contort themselves to meet the needs of the funders. So, and then I just wanted to say from a personal perspective, it's just, I had no idea that perfectionism and urgency was a white supremacy culture thing. Perfectionism and urgency is what took me out last summer, like in a very real way. And it was so eye-opening and intense to realize that this is a product of that. So I'm really grateful to have been here. And thank you.
Thank you for your radical authenticity and transparency, and sharing that those 2 things led to your unwellness, or you not being able to show up how you want to in the world. The reality is that white identity is not defined or not designed to benefit all white people, but just the most elite of the white people, the folks who have the most control of resources. That's why you look to Appalachian white working class communities. White identities don't always benefit them. When it does benefit them, it means that they're actually stratifying people of color in order to get a little bit closer to a ruling class. And that's the way that capitalism, again, conflates that power. And so there is a benefit in addressing internalized and interpersonal white supremacy as a person who has white or light skin, and creating a culture of consent, right? I always have this conversation with white folks when they go, oh, well, white supremacy doesn't hurt me. And I would tend to say that I think it's a soul wound, and it comes from like my Blackness and my Native communities. I think it's a soul wound to be born into a violent system where you have no choice but to be assigned violent by your very existence. There's not consent in that. There's not transformation in that. And when your identity, particularly for those who are part of the settler colonial project, is so shaped by those things, and systems force you back into those identities. Yeah, I wouldn't say that's just. I wouldn't say that's consent-based. So thank you for sharing, everyone. For the purpose of time, we're going to move on just a bit. So I'm going to share these slides with folks, but I really want everyone to be asking themselves about next steps. The first question I want us to consider and be curious about are what practices can you adopt to address the internalized white supremacy culture within your individual organizing within Stop the Money Pipeline. Again, just like Malik said in the chat, if folks aren't quote unquote decolonizing or addressing internalized white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy, they don't even see the ways in which their beliefs and their behavior contribute to larger problems. The second question I want you to really be thinking through as you engage with the JEDI group is what ways could Stop the Money Pipeline reinforce interpersonal and institutional white supremacy? And then how can we disrupt it? Right? When everyone was talking about the funders, I thought, what would it look like if Stop the Money Pipeline made a foundational demand that we would fund a percentage of our BIPOC frontline no matter what, right? That we told our funders that at this percent of all of the budget for this coalition's operation, for it to even exist, requires us to fund this amount of people. What would that look like? How could we subvert and refuse to participate in those broader systems of violence? The other question that I want us to be thinking about is in what ways might we transform internally, shifting Stop the Money Pipeline institutionally in order to transform the structure, as in the coalition that's in this nonprofit industrial complex, toward Malkia's demands, where Malkia said, for us to truly be progressive organizers or a progressive movement, we must be addressing structural racism. Another way to put it is, how do we organize to make Stop the Money Pipeline an anti-racist structure within the nonprofit coalition spaces? Next, I'm going to pause just for any other questions. You can stack if there are any, and I'm going to see if I can get us out of here early. I think we're supposed to go to 1:30, but I think I'm wrapping it up. Which my staff would be like, wow, you did that so fast. Okay, so taking it back from the structural request for us to consider Stop the Money Pipeline as an institution structure and bringing it back down, like Malik highlighted for us, to the individual interpersonal. There's a reason why folks say the personal is political. We are part of our ecosystem, right? We are the rocks and the trees and the birds. We are all a part of this ecosystem. So to say that we're only changing structures doesn't do it, right? We can change a structure and then the generation before us can change that structure again, or create new violent institutions. And so we always have to be asking ourselves these questions. We must acknowledge that transforming structures does not happen in a single lifetime. It requires a complex and coordinated effort, a critical mass of institutions reimagined. And as we do this work, we must always acknowledge that we make up the institutions, that we make up the structures, and we create the conditions to shift power. So then, anti-racism requires active practice and commitment to ask oneself this question: is this the performance of justice, or do my actions actually disrupt white supremacy? So the next thing that I will request everyone to do, if they feel comfortable, is to reflect in the chat or on deck, if you're more of a verbal person and would like to speak, how your internalized white supremacy behaviors have shaped your own thoughts and beliefs. Kind of go through, for me, like I did with perfectionism, a belief that you've had about yourself, and then maybe how it's manifested toward others. Now, again, this invitation is not to be a white confessional, but just to normalize that we all have this stuff. It's interpersonal, it's internalized, it's structural, and it's institutional. Anyone like to share? I already admitted I'm just like deep, like just look at all the white supremacy culture behaviors, and I just have spent years unpacking them. Malik, you unmuted. You ready to talk?
Sure. I guess, for me, it's a little bit different approach. I've been addressing white supremacy for most of my life and taking an anti-racist approach to it. So I'm always countering my response to white supremacy in terms of what the system is trying to do and what it is trying to predict and trying to force me to do. So I'm constantly aware of that. And unless you have a counter process to counter that, then you will fall victim to white supremacy, implicit bias, and other things. one thing I did wanted to say though was that in this, not just this particular group, but I don't think this particular society understands what white supremacy is. And I'll just say this, and people can process it how they like. I spoke to an individual years ago. He worked with Malcolm X, actually. He was a former press secretary for Malcolm X. And he said, what is the difference between a racist and a white supremacist? And I said, what is the difference? And he said, well, basically in terms of the racist doesn't really want you around, wants to be around you. He's going to fight you. It's what we see as that, what happened at the Capitol. He said, but a white supremacist doesn't mind if you are around so long as they are in control. So we have to understand that in terms of this particular society, all these organizations are white supremacist organizations because Black people are not in control. So so starting there is where we really need to begin the conversation, that this is a white supremacist society. They're okay with people of color being there, but they're not going to be in control.
Yeah.
So understanding that is something that I wanted to be able to share with folks.
Yeah, thank you. I think it just underscores what I said around white identity, that, Hess's work. Whenever Hess outlines what is the ideal to subverting white supremacy culture, his assertions say that a white traitor identity or a white abolitionist identity is the antidote, which is about power, about giving away your power, about disrupting it, and more than just diversity and representation. So thank you for sharing, your link. Anyone else in our time together like to share? So the last thing is looking back at, oh, we've got a comment, I'm sorry, let me read it for everyone. Cheryl shared that I was raised to understand my value equals my accomplishments. I've struggled to overcome this, and I've struggled with judging others in that framework. Very helpful to think of this as white supremacist trick. Yes. Taryn said, I relate to many of them, especially perfectionism. I too am a Virgo, but I see my expectations stretch not only for myself, but to my children, my students, and others. Right. And so we then begin to habituate and socialize other folks into this very violent dynamic. So using the culture of white supremacy document, when you look at the ways that you've internalized white supremacy culture, the last question as we close our time together is, how can you refuse to participate? Most of you shared in the chat that you were going to be a commitment to anti-racism after this. And so this is your way, interpersonally, institutionally, or internalized. How will you choose today to not participate in white supremacy culture? For example, I'm not going to go back and fix the typos that I observed in this presentation before I submit a copy and share with y'all. It's real hard though. You can stack on deck or you can put it in the comments. Oh, Julia shared that I think my fear of conflict is manifested in me not speaking up on occasions when I'm bothered or hurt by something, and instead valuing letting it go as maturity rather than cowardice. Interpersonally, it has led to me drop people or have superficial relationships instead of having the conflict. Stephanie shared looking at coworkers and other people as replaceable, commodifying them, setting high standards, and if those aren't met, then those people need to be removed or replaced. Yeah, that's real stuff. Anyone else like to share how they will refuse to participate today or in the future around white supremacy culture? Clara commits to sharing power. When I see it, I want to have the courage to name it, said Susan. Heather said, speak up. Tempest didn't say this out loud, but I know that Tempest would invite y'all to move out of the way. Black people have been organizing for our liberation, and we do it quite well. Another person said, stepping back creates space. reflecting more on how my own behaviors impact my students. Commit to challenging my coworkers and bosses. Commit to asking myself, is this white supremacy? Being relentless in interventions, not accepting lazy racism and lazy sexism. I will engage in generative conflict, even if I'm afraid. Yes. These are all lovely commitments. And the beauty of accountability is that no one can hold us accountable. We have to choose to be accountable. So I hope that stating this in the chat is your first step to self-accountability. I also want to name that learning about the problem is not an act of justice. Black folks and people of color have been telling you about the problem for centuries. Joining a book club or following us on Instagram, listening to our podcast, retweeting us is not justice. Again, like the last question that I asked you, is this the performance of justice, or does this actually disrupt white supremacy? Is it your refusal to participate and instead uplift generative systems that are restorative, that are pro-Black, that relinquish power back from capitalism, the wealthy elite, back from cis het white Christian men in the patriarchy, back from the white landowners? How are you choosing to be a commitment to disruption? So thank you so much for allowing me to do this high level conversation. Thank you for joining me in these commitments, understanding that we can't solve all of these things. I hope this will start a conversation that is necessary within Stop the Money pipeline, and that JEDI can be the lead organizing working group to get some demands inside our infrastructure and codified that really honor Stop the Money pipeline being an anti-racist coalition, rather than recapitulating the same sort of colonizing white supremacy dynamics that create harm, the same harm that we say we don't want corporations to be engaging in. So thank you. Questions? I think I missed it because everything's going very fast. Can you hop on? Okay, Emma says, I downward spiral with the high standard expectation stuff. How do I distinguish white supremacy culture from trying to get things done? Are they the same? How to untangle? Is there an internal dialogue part of the culture? Yeah, so I think that it can get really, when we're talking about like psychosocial behavior and how white identity and white supremacy have shaped many of our psyches and how we see ourselves and how we see ourselves in the world, getting things done or hustle culture, it's hard to know, is that like really me? Is that a part of my core character? Or is it something else? Is it external? So I want to say that like Black excellence exists. Black folks do incredible work with very, very little. And so excellence is not necessarily a function of urgency. Excellence and quality is not necessarily a function of grind culture. And so really it's about mindfulness and about looking at what really is informing. I always invite folks who are trying to figure out, like, is this white supremacy culture and white identity, or is this me? Do the friend on the park bench practice. It's a practice where you say, if a friend came, if you sat down to a stranger or someone who you were friendly with, and they said, here's what's going on with me, what advice would you give them being removed? And if the advice is like, take it easy and you don't have to be perfect, well, that tells you that there's something else external and it's not a part of like a core identity driving you. So that's the fast and easy version. And then also call on your community. You have elders and you have ancestors and you have comrades who are in solidarity who can give you that feedback. So you can also tell that I'm a licensed counselor whenever I'm not organizing UnKoch my campus, can't you? It's like, oh, that was my counselor hat I put on. Any other questions? All right. Well, if there are no more questions, I will give you back your time. Thanks, y'all. So anticlimactic, just like.
Bye, everybody.
Jasmine, that was amazing. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Hey,
Yes.